First of all, I would like to thank Filippo Scianna for inviting me. And can you hear me?
Funziona.
Yeah. Okay.
Sì,
And
le cuffie funzionano per la traduzione. Sono state riassettate, grazie.
and also to thank Chiara Mascarello and Francesco Torme for the wonderful organization and for giving us the opportunity to be in this fantastic setting. So also to the great job of the two translators. So I would like to give a good round of applause to all these people for allowing to be here. Okay, so I will not, in this talk, I will not show you any results from neuroimaging studies or blobs on the brain or things like that. Even though in my career I have done studies using neuroimaging to investigate the neural correlates of contemplative practices, this is not the topic of my talk today. Today I would like to give you a brief glimpse of an influential theory in neuroscience, which is becoming really a hot topic because it promises to explain under a very general single principle, which is called the principle of minimization of free energy or minimization of surprise. I was saying, to explain under this one principle phenomena as diverse as perception, action, learning, attention, decision-making, and planning. And in the second part, I would like to show you or to argue that this particular framework is particularly suited for thinking about contemplative studies or contemplative practice. The title that I chose for this talk is Inactive Inference, and it plays on the notion that the apparent inactivity of meditation is in fact hiding a process of quite an active process, and a peculiar one at that, of specific epistemic value. Okay, so this theory of active inference, as I said, is based on the so-called free energy principle. Free energy is a concept, a notion mutuated from both statistical thermodynamics, but also from information theory. And I will not go into details of that because mathematically it's quite complicated. Suffices to say that it's a quantity that it's an upper bound on surprise. So since self-organizing system, the basic notion is that maintain themselves in their form and function, avoiding surprising states, that is, states that are far from the, let's say, phenotype that defines them, then by minimizing free energy, which is an upper bound, they are able to minimize surprise over the long term, and so to maintain themselves viable. Of course, living beings, sentient beings, are a class of self-organizing systems, and although the notion of surprise minimization as the essential defining characteristics of living beings may seem a strange notion, quite bizarre, in fact, it's not so strange, because let's think about, for a moment, about homeostasis. So, an organism is able to keep on living only if maintains its set of internal parameters within a specific and quite restricted bound. Let's think about oxygen or glucose level in the blood, pH, and so on. Now, the the organism has to minimize the probability of incurring in states that are far from this homeostatic range. And in this picture, you can see that even though being out of water for a fish is a very surprising state that the fish will try at any cost to avoid, like the poor guy in the picture was not able to do. So, in essence, living beings are a self-evident demonstration of the capacity of shielding themselves, at least temporarily, from the entropic dissolution that is mandated from the second principle of thermodynamics, or more precisely from the fluctuation theorem. It's quite intriguing to me that this notion, which is positioned or posited at the very core of the nature of living beings, is so primal, but you can find something similar in the foundational mythologies of almost any culture. That is the notion of order and disorder, the notion of cosmos and chaos. So I find that particularly interesting. Now, I said that living beings are defined by their operating mode of minimizing surprise. But of course, surprise minimization rests on the notions of a model. You can be surprised only with respect to some expectation. Now, in this case, the model that the organism, and I will argue that the organism does not have a model of its world, is a model of its world. This is an important difference. So, a generative model is basically a model of how external causes generate internal sensation. And perception, for instance, entails the inversion of this model. So when we perceive something, for instance, we perceive this as a battle, that means that we have inverted our generative model of going from an external causes to a visual sensation. Now I have to go from the visual sensation to infer, and so it's a process of inference, infer what is the cause in the external world that generated my sensation. And here so in this, I'm just showing you a very simple example. Here I'm watching this shadow impressed on a wall, and inverting that model means that I posit, I infer, I generate a virtual cause that is a hand that is positioned between a source of light and the wall. Now, when I infer that that is the cause generating my sensation, in turn, I also generate a visual expectation, in this case, that if I turn around, I will actually see a hand there. So there is a prediction of the next sensation. Now, it may very well be that what is generating that sensation is not what I expected. In that case, the discrepancy between the expected sensation and the actual one is the so-called prediction error, and that is the crucial element here. So, basically, minimizing surprise can be realized by a self-organizing system by a process of minimizing prediction error. This is the core business of living beings, according to this theory, minimizing prediction error. And it's the only important, prediction error, in essence, it's the only important thing because it's the only important things that the world is telling us. It's the only valid teaching signal. It's the reality check. Now, what kind of structure is needed for implementing a generative model. So, a generative model is most probably a hierarchical model, because we live in a complex environment, and in this environment there are causal chains of events that span different spatio-temporal scales. So we need a hierarchical structure of adequate complexity to be able to reflect that. In this picture, I have schematized a very simple hierarchical structure with 3 representing levels: a lower level that is closer to sensory surfaces, and not sure if I can, yeah, that, and a middle level and a higher level. And you can see that higher level provide a prediction for the state of the level that is below them. And this prediction is compared with the actual state of the lower level. The discrepancy between the two goes back, travels back up the hierarchy in order to provide a correction, a revision of the initial prediction. So that is a teaching signal. Note also that there is a kind of gradient going from fast changing regularities, that is the coding for fast changing regularities in the lower level, the one closer to the sensory surfaces, and higher levels that code for events or statistical regularity of a much coarser spatiotemporal grain. In a sense, going up the hierarchy, we travel from percepts to concepts. And this is also interesting for our purposes here, because in this theory, the temporal depth, or you could say the number of layers in this hierarchy, has been linked to the degree of consciousness of the system. So a system that has a very thin temporal depth then is not able to entertain processes of predictions or postdictions that are much extended in time. So in this simple scheme, although it may seem a bit messy, you can also see something like this. This arrow is being labeled as precision expectation. There is a problem. I traduttori non sentono, ma perché è un problema mio che sono lontano? Ah, ok. In the meantime, I'm drinking.
L'equanimità, prima non sentivamo noi,
Esatto.
adesso non sentono loro. Poi sentiremo tutti e due, spero.
Provo? Okay. So, provo? Okay. Okay. So I'm going ahead. So, that yellow arrow, the orange dashed arrow that you see in that model indicates that prediction involves not only the expected magnitude of the sensory signal, but also its reliability or precision in technical jargon. And we will come back to that shortly. But that is an important, very, very important notion, that of the how precise do we expect the signal from the world would be. So, and where is this model implemented? I would say particularly in the brain, because the brain has a very peculiar structure. It has a huge degree of connectivity, and it has been estimated that there are 10 to the 10th power of neurons in an adult human brain, and that amounts to 10 to the 14th power of synapses, which is a huge number. So, since we are a species that has a very wide gamut of potential interaction with our world, and so a very potentially we encounter a very rich series of causal concatenations of events in the world. To be able to reflect that, we need a structure of similar complexity. Now, this idea of predictive coding is very interesting also because this way of elaborating information has also two very big advantages. One is computational efficiency, because the only thing that we need to process is the prediction error. It's not, we don't need to process the full flow of sensory information that hits our receptors, but what travels up the hierarchy is just the discrepancy between what we expect and what we get. So this is very, very important. The other thing is that the organism is able to operate as with a higher speed. We are able to react to things much quicker compared to the actual speed of neural transmission, because we are always working in a proactive fashion, in a sense. Okay, one question that immediately will have appeared in your mind is, where does this generative model comes from? Or otherwise said, what kind of process can generate the generative model? The idea here is that the continuous interaction or friction between a living being and its environmental niche literally a long time informs or sculpts its structure and causal dynamics. So that its structure and internal dynamics comes to reflect, represent, or reenact the causal chains of events that the organism most frequently encounters in its niche. And here comes to my mind the beautiful discussion about Paticca Samuppada that Bruno Lo Turco expounded so well in his talk. Also, you could also see it in this way, like the complex causal network of events of deep ecology that Professor Pasqualotto talked about, in a sense, becomes introjected and become part of the actual structure and dynamic of the organism. So, in short, the agent comes to embody a generative model of its world, and I said embody, just to point out that there is a crucial difference with respect to the classical representationalist view of cognition. So the sentient being here is, rather than has, a model of its world. So there is no central controller that uses this representation. And now, for a social species like we are, other individuals are a very salient characteristics of our niche. So the relationship with the other is, at a very fundamental level, constitutive of our own identity. And Peter Hershock talked the other day about the so-called Cambrian explosion, about 600 million years ago, when most of the animal phyla appeared. And it's interesting because it has been argued that it is exactly at that time that nervous system, and especially the sensory motor system, had an abrupt increase. And why? Because in an environment that becomes populated with other agents, of course you need to predict a series of causal series of events that are much more complex compared to, let's say, simple unicellular or multicellular organisms that live in the primordial soup. So these kind of organisms don't need a very elaborate predictive model of the world. They can live very easily in the present. But if you are in an environment when there is a predator that is going to come to eat you, and you have to run away, or you have to look for reproductive patterns and so on, then it becomes necessary to have a model of your world that is also able to predict far in advance and more complex situations. So basically the idea is that the mind of beings that are advanced from a phylogenetical point of view, their mind has been greatly shaped in response to other minds. Okay, so I've been saying that the modus operandi of living beings is the minimization of prediction error. But in practice, how can we minimize prediction error? So there are two basic ways, at least for, let's say, minimization of the current prediction error. One is the perception path. So in the perception path, we can change our initial prediction or belief or hypothesis or a priori, if we want to use a Kantian term, to better match the current sensory evidence. Then there is an alternative path, which is the path of the action. We can change the world to make it more similar to our initial beliefs. So we can go and move in the world, so to go and find exactly that subspace of the sensory world that matches what we expected. Note that these two ways are very thoroughly intertwined, and this is because of the circularity of a sensory motor process. We have actively guided perception and perceptually guided action, always. That is, defining characteristics of biology. Now, the relative importance at any given moment in time of one or the other path depends on what? On the estimated newsworthiness or the reliability of the incoming sensory signal, and especially compared to the strength of our beliefs. So, if we are expecting a precise sensory signal, and remember that scheme before of the hierarchical model when I was saying that we do not only anticipate the magnitude of the incoming signal, but also its reliability. So when we expect a precise sensory signal, it makes perfect sense to rely more on the perceptual path, because we estimated that the word, what the word is telling us is reliable, and so makes for a very good teaching signal, and we should allow it to change our initial beliefs. On the other hand, if we expect that the sensory signal is noisy or unreliable, then it makes more sense to actually stick to our initial hypothesis or belief and move so to minimize prediction error by finding the sensation that matches our belief. So this, the action path is a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy path, which it may seem, at the outset as something negative, but there are situations when actually it's the best thing to do. So when I wake up in the middle of the night and I want to turn the light on, the sensory signal, the visual signal has no information really. It's too noisy, it's too unreliable. So I have to rely on my a priori belief of where the switch is. And so I go there and I switch, and then I can rely on the visual signal because now its precision has increased. So it's not, it's something that has its role. Now, it's very interesting from the neurophysiological point of view that the mechanism of precision has been linked to the cognitive function of attention. It is by attention means raising the expected precision on an information channel. That is amplifying the prediction error that comes from that source, because that is the teaching signal that we want to use. And it's actually quite funny that in Italian, when you want to say that something is reliable, we say attendibile, which means worth of attention. So it matches very well. Now, before talking about how all of this has to do with meditation, which is, I'm sure, something that most of you are more interested in, we need one last notion, and I beg your pardon because it's late and it's a bit complicated, but hopefully we can make it simpler. And that notion is the notion of pragmatic and epistemic value of a policy or course of action. We have, up to now, we have talked about minimization of surprise or free energy or prediction error just for the present situation. And that accounts for both perception, elementary motor acts, and learning. Now, in this case, when we are talking about minimization of prediction error in the present moment, that mathematically entails the minimization of the so-called variational free energy, but we don't go into the details for the moment about that, but it's enough to understand that minimization means mathematically minimizing both the complexity of our generative model and maximizing its accuracy. Minimizing complexity means that we choose we try to change our beliefs so that they match in the sensory data, but we don't want to change them too much because we want to keep the model as simple as possible. This is basically another way of stating the principle of the Occam's razor. So we want to make our model as accurate as possible, but without making it overly complex. Why? Because a complex model does not generalize well, it's overfitting, and it's also computationally expensive, and neurally it's metabolically expensive. Now, this is just for when we want to minimize the free energy or the prediction error of the present. But complex sentient beings have the peculiar faculty of planning, being able to plan and decide about elaborate courses of action for the future, according to our desires and motivation. So, the generative model must also include the agent itself in its set of representation to be able to predict the consequences of its own action. In this case, in order to be able to make a selection among the all possible courses of action and to to be able to make decision effectively. In this particular theory, we have to minimize the so-called free energy or prediction error of the future, what we expect in the future. And this can be mathematically decomposed in two elements, and these are so-called reward policy, value of the policy, and the information gain of the policy. So we want, at the same time, maximize the pragmatic value of a policy, of a course of action, which means we want to maximize the probability that that policy will bring about the preferred states for my phenotype, my desired states. But at the same time, we want to maximize the epistemic value of a policy, that is, the expected information gain that will result from that course of action. Because if I get a good information, then my model in the future will be better able to predict. I like here also to find another parallel. To me, this theory is particularly elegant and beautiful because it also has this notion at its core that are very archetypical. Think about, for instance, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. So the pragmatic tree of life and the epistemic, the tree of knowledge. Okay. Now, in this view, basically life or a living being is seen as a process of self-evidencing. Why? Because if the living being is a model of its world, all that it tries to do by minimizing surprise or minimizing prediction error can also be stated as finding evidence for its own model or for the model that it is. So acting so as to preserve the model of the world that it is, finding evidence for its own existence. This idea that a living being is a generative model of its world that continuously solicits evidence to confirm itself is also very similar to another influential theory by Francisco Varela and also Umberto Maturana, the theory of autopoiesis, where a living organism was seen as a network of processes that continuously recreate the conditions for their own existence. So I find these two views very, very much similar, even though there are people like Ivan Thompson that argue differently. In my opinion, they're very similar in spirit. In both of these theories, the crucial thing is the error. Also in autopoiesis, Francisco Varela used to say that cognition occurs in the rupture of autopoiesis. That is, the important things are the perturbation of the systems, and then how the system accommodates that perturbation, or we can say the prediction error, is where actual meaning arises. So in a sense, error is the fabric on which meaning is built. And I would like here to recall the talk by Peter Hershock yesterday that pointed out the danger of a future where error is removed by this intelligent technology. Also, another important point, I think that the role or the gift that a spiritual teacher, but actually any meaningful interpersonal relationship can give, is that of virtuously frustrating our expectations. So, providing, by doing so, the opportunity, that teaching signal, that prediction error for improvement. And here I would like to make maybe a far-fetched connection to some core Buddhist notion. The experts here, I hope they will forgive my intrusion on their field, but this is just something that, to me, it is interesting. So you all know much better than me the concept of anatta. I used to say anatta, but now I learned that you should say anatta. As in this framework, I find it very similar, this concept, to the idea that the self is a process, is not an entity, is not an ontology. There is no ontology. It's a process of self-confirmation without any fixed ontology. Anicca is that mental phenomena are similarly devoid of any ontology, but impermanently created by the meeting of evidence and beliefs, these two streams that influence each other in a circular way. And finally, dukkha, it reminded me of this undercurrent of existential anxiety for the potential failures of self-confirmation, like as if any living being could have, being a process of self-evidencing. To this is also associated the possibility of failure of this self-evidencing. And I think that, maybe I'm wrong here, but all these three notions maybe are subsumed by the notion of shunyata, at least in the interpretation of Nagarjuna, as discussed by Emanuela Magno on Friday, that everything is empty of ontological weight, but is created on the fly by a network of causal processes, so which recalls the other notion of paticca samuppada, or originary coproduction. Now we come finally to the practice of meditation. I will say as a premise that I'm going to talk a bit more specifically about the practice of Zazen, because it's the tradition that I'm more familiar with, but of course this framework can be applied to other types of contemplative practices and with appropriate modification. So I would like to argue that the apparent inaction of meditation hides, in fact, an active and a very peculiar process of epistemic value. Something similar to the Latin notion of otium, which was a time devoted to spiritual, philosophical, or artistic activities, as opposed to the busyness of negotium. In this sense, Zazen can be seen as the practice of skillfully orchestrating the suspension of all the usual policies, and I would say pragmatic policies, associated with our tendencies to move towards what we like and away from what we dislike. In this perspective, the Zazen posture can be seen as a symbolic embodiment of the notion of mushotoku, that is, nothing to be attained, which was also remarked by Professor Tollini when talking about mindfulness and Zen, and highlighting the distinction between technique and practice. So, in this way, we can see that the legs folded with the feet turned upside down in the lotus position hint to the suspension of the intentionality of walking motion. The hands resting in the cosmic mudra, in the Hokkaijo-in, symbolize a refrain from grasping and pushing away. The mouth shut with the upper and lower teeth lightly touching hints about shelving our speaking habits. The eyes kept half open and without looking around indicate avoiding the seductive pool of dreamlike imagery and visual foraging of the environment. And finally, the condition of affective equanimity brings this kind of poise into the mental and affective realm and indicates the putting aside of value judgments and rumination. Now, note the active and most of all embodied activity, embodied quality of this apparent inactivity. In fact, we may want to have a look at a famous sutra about this, and I'm sure you all know the sutra, and is the apamada vaga in the Dhammapada, and we also received the volume in this conference. Thanks a lot for that. One translation, and I haven't checked if this is the translation present in the book, but one translation which is very, very common is, heedfulness is the path to the deathless, heedlessness is the path to death. The heedful die not, the heedless are as if dead already. And in a sense, this seems to highlight the role of a kind of a disembodied cognitive quality, that of attention. But I would like to also propose another translation, not by me, by a teacher, actually, a female nun, a nun in the Zen Soto tradition. And if we go back to this word, this term heedfulness, we go back to the original Pali, the term is apamada, which is the negation of pamada. And what pamada means slothful, indolent, negligent, indifferent, careless. So another translation could be this one, which stresses much more the active nature of meditative inaction, if we want. Endeavor is the eternal way. Neglect is the way to death. People who spur themselves on happily never die. People wallowing in self-indulgence, even though they have life, are as if dead already. But what is this attitude supposed to bring about? Now, I will propose here that the contemplative praxis maximizes the chance of a special kind of learning. And here I'm using this picture from a vase, a Greek vase of the 500 BC, where you can see Ulysses that is having himself tied to the ship's mast in order to be able to hear the siren song without being drawn fatally to the rocks. Now, as you know, in the Greek mythology, the sirens were not like women with the fish body, but with the body of a bird. And this is what is portrayed here. But I find this picture particularly useful to remind us that meditation is not simply a strategy to assuage anxiety by reducing uncertainty. You know, we put ourselves in a very safe situation, but it may be a way of constraining dynamics, as Ulysses that is bound to the mast, against habitual reactive patterns, so that we can learn something about ourselves. Under the virtual boundary that is staged by contemplative inaction, and maybe one could say that this is a sacrifice if we go to the etymology of a sacrifice, to make something sacred, that is to delimitate a special place, and this is the space that is staged by contemplative inaction. Now, the process of active inference that I've been talking about cannot be realized by actually foraging evidence by overt behavior because of the immobility. And so it takes effectively an inward directed epistemic turn. providing a unique opportunity for the meditator's generative model to learn about itself, or at least to learn about parts of itself. And in Dogen Zenji Fukanza Zengi, we also read something that is very similar to this notion. Learn the backward step that turns the light inwardly to illuminate yourself. And this is allowed and fostered by a heedful attitude, but a kind of a embodied heedful attitude. And I would say that the attention that is in meditation is not really attention to the body. It's more like attention through the body. The body is part of the attentive process. So, in this perspective, I would like to argue that attention and mind wandering in meditation are not two things that are the enemy one of the other, but they're like allies. Before that, we could even conceptualize mind wandering as the default epistemic policy that installs itself when we are not engaged in reward-seeking or punishment-avoiding policies. That is when we are at rest. And I'm using default here specifically because it has been shown by neuroimaging study that the activity of related to spontaneous thoughts and mind wandering has been associated with activity of a specific network of brain region, and these are called the default mode network because that's the state that the brain goes back to when we stop being busy in an external task. In this view, contemplative practice can be seen as a skilled optimization of this problem, of this process. So a kind of a skilled optimization of the mind-wandering process. Not that mind-wandering is a function that has a very, very high adaptive value because it provides the opportunity for reflection, creative problem solving, planning, trying out virtually some possibilities without having to suffer the actual consequences. And so it's a very important process. And the natural alternation of episodes of mind wandering and meditative presence represent an epistemically rich dynamics where the generative model that we are starts to subtly learn not about the external world this time, but about itself. And this knowledge does not have to be fully conscious necessarily, but may be even somewhat preconscious or intuitive. And may concern especially the dynamical relationship between mental activity and its bodily effects, which is interesting because that means that it works also on the affective processes. Because in the theory of active inference, emotions are simply an inference about the interoceptive states. So that is an interpretation of an interpretation of the internal state of our body given our pre-existing set of beliefs or hypotheses. So in this perspective, the important point of meditation is not to seal up attention, for instance, on the breathing from any intrusion, but rather to make it permeable to the richness of one's own lived life and perhaps to something beyond that, perhaps to the material in the alaya vijnana, in the storehouse consciousness that may surface during meditation. Mind-wandering episode, in this sense, may not be impediments, but the very fuel on which the meditative exercise function. But of course, with an attitude of letting them go. We could also say that maybe karma is the fuel on which enlightenment proceeds. And here I like to also cite an author which is very dear to me, which is James Hillman. And James Hillman was not talking about meditation at all here, but I found his thought very much in line with this theoretical framework. And here in this piece that was called The Thought of the Heart and the Soul of the World, he said, sensing the world and imagining the world are not divided in the aesthetic response of the heart. To sense penetratingly, we must imagine, and to imagine accurately, we must sense. And so, really, it seems to me that this is the same idea of the necessity of these two streams in this process. One that goes from the mind to the world, and it is the faculty of imagination, and is built on our prior beliefs, on the set of regularities that have deposited in our internal model. And the other is the response from the world. But both are really necessary. And it also very close, if some of you remember the chapter in the Shobogenzo of Dogen, the Kuge, which means something like celestial flowers, but actually it's the idea is that of you know, that little silvery flies that appear when you close your eyes, the phosphines, that in Japanese are taken as symbols of something that is illusory. Dogen Zenji says, do not look for enlightenment outside of delusion. That is a short-sighted view. So there is no chance in this framework to see things as they are. And I'm recalling again the talk of Professor Tollini, pointing out some possible misunderstanding of this kind of slogans. Because if the statement is naively interpreted as a direct, immediated contact between mind and world, it's impossible. We always have the sensory veil, so our apprehension of the world is always mediated. But what is out there can only be inferred through the sensory veil based on our set of beliefs, that there is no other way. But this is not to negate the existence of a reality out there. It simply says that we are always inevitably making things up, although the building blocks for doing that are not random, because they are continuously and have been continuously shaped but our interaction with the world out there. And I find it very interesting to think that maybe this is really a middle way between the position of idealism and materialism. Because yes, we are making the world up, but not in a random way, because the form with which we interpret the world have been sculpted by the interaction with something out there that we cannot know directly, but it is there. So perhaps the point of imagination, the point of meditation is not to abolish imagination, but to realize the fantastic nature of reality. And this is another quote from James Hillman. He said, we call reality that fantasy which we don't see as a fantasy. Now, when I'm getting towards the end of the talk, it's important to highlight that because of our very capacity for agency, we tend to fashion our world as we expect it to be during the course of our life, making it more and more predictable, and so that our preferred state become more and more accessible. And again, Peter Herzog mentioned today the potential dangers of intelligent technology, especially for what concerns social networks and preference collecting algorithm. You are led to fashion a perfect echo chamber for yourself a perfectly confirmative niche. The stroke of genius here is that you are persuaded that you are just exercising your freedom of choice in doing that. Because of that, the generative model that we are tends to become progressively, as we pass adulthood, I would say, less complex because there is a pruning of synaptic connection, more driven by prior beliefs, we listen less to the world, more prone to overgeneralization, and more refractory to revision. It is intriguing in the light of the notions that we've been discussing that many spiritual traditions actually point to the necessity of an unlearning process to escape the limitation imposed by a well-established but rigidified cognitive structure. And here I'm using just 3 examples from 3 different traditions, and you probably know these very well. One is from Shunryu Suzuki in Zen Mind's Beginner's Mind. In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few. In the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tzu, in pursuit of learning, every day there is more. In the pursuit of the Tao, every day there is less. And finally, in the Gospel of Matthew, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And we can also recall the quote, famous quote from Picasso that says, it took me 4 years to paint like Raphael, but a lifetime to paint like a child. So the idea here is that since concepts are by definition bounded, and to define comes from the Latin finis, limit, any overlearned notion also represents a hindrance for understanding of what was left out of that notion in the first place. So how can this work in regress take place? Obviously, it cannot be through a straightforward simplification of the generative model, because we have seen that already occurs as we age and leads to overgeneralization and pure accuracy. I propose that contemplative practices may help both in realizing the conditional nature of our perception and action, that is conditional on our set of beliefs, and in rendering such set of beliefs more malleable and liable to revision. The crucial point here is that by paying a fully embodied presence to the moment-by-moment changes in the sensory and mental experience, this attitude de-emphasizes the weight of pre-established ingrained beliefs and expectations, allowing this way latent possibilities or alternatives to become available, both for perception and behavior. And I think that this de-emphasis may be what is alluded to by the notion of emptiness, or also empty hand, letting go, not grasping, or a flexible mind. And to conclude, I would like again to stress the possibility of misunderstanding that may occur when we hear these notions that kind of symbolize a certain practice, like living in the present, because I think it's certainly possible to be held hostage by the present moment, by becoming too focused on either the attainment of immediate pleasures or on our current uncomfortable contingencies. Now, memory is important, as Peter Hershock reminded us. Of course, a clear look and acceptance of the present situation is necessary and useful, but if it is all that is advocated, it definitely falls short. On Friday, Matteo Cestari talked about the risk of modernist Buddhism, Actually, there is some experimental evidence that mindfulness practice make already self-centered individual that particular personality makeup even less pro-social. There is an interesting study that has been published very recently. Even the concept of selflessness is problematic and prone to be mistaken. Kodo Sawaki, a famous Zen teacher, used to say, Zazen is the self selving the self by itself. So we should be wary of interpreting this notion of self in a simplistic way. Also, this tendency of immediate gratification in modern society that may be epitomized by the idea of living in the present corresponds to a strong reward delay discounting bias. That is the phenomenon by which we tend to devalue rewards that are farther out in the future. I think the meditative practice may actually work as an antidote to this, because by sitting boringly, without doing anything, we avoid reinforcing the old set of beliefs and behaviors by following impulses immediately with habitual reaction, thus opening up the door for alternative possibilities. And this is also how the epistemic value or auto-epistemic value accrued through contemplative practice can beget pragmatically valued repercussions when off the cushion. The present, if we intend it as a very restricted self of prediction and confirmation, is very poor. It's like the world of an amoeba, which we don't want to turn to by contemplative practice. So we don't want to forcefully prevent the present to become enriched and enlivened by both the past and future. And I would like to finish my talk with a quote from Nelson Mandela that was talking about his long years in prison, which speaks directly to the importance of long-term expectations, or what we commonly call faith. And this is the quote: "I always knew that someday I would once again feel the grass under my feet and walk in the sunshine as a free man." These are not the words of somebody that is only looking at the present situation. Thank you.